Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We know the last few weeks we've had a good few attacks around ransomware, so we feel that this session will be a good opportunity to share our experts' knowledge in this field. We have Liz O'Neill and Paul Hogan here with us, who will be presenting to you all on the key steps to preventing a ransomware attack. Paul is the Chief Technology Officer and Liz is the Head of Operations and Response at Ward Solutions. They will help you have better clarity over the immensity of these kind of attacks and what exact precautions need to be taken. Just to let you know, a recorded version of the webinar will be available after the session, and we have a free assessment toolkit available at the end of the session also. Paul and Liz will take you through them. We'd love to hear from you. So as you know already, you can drop in your questions in the chat box, and we will answer them during and at the end of the session. So for those of you just joining us right now, welcome to our webinar again, Key Steps to Preventing a Ransomware Attack. Now I'll hand this over to Liz. Thank you. Sorry, I'll hand this over to Paul Hogan. Sorry. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar. So what we're going to do initially is talk a little bit about what ransomware is, how does it work, and then we're going to look at some of the solutions that you can put in place in order to help you better protect your organization. So ransomware is something that's not new. It's something that we deal with on a daily basis. It's been around, I suppose, since the AIDS Trojan back in 1989. It's been made, I suppose, more relevant and prominent recently with attacks such as WannaCry and GoldenEye, but that does not mean it hasn't been around for a long time. It most certainly has. The one thing that we've seen as an organization over the last number of years is, I suppose, the acceleration of ransomware. And obviously, it's becoming a very viable business model for cyber criminals. If you take it back in 2015, and these are just US figures only, there was $24 million lost due to ransomware. In 2016, the first couple of months of 2016, it was up to 209 million. I think the estimates, and the survey wasn't completed for 2016, was that by the end of the year it was over $1 billion worth of money lost due to ransomware. So it really is an issue, and despite, I suppose, the large profile attacks, it really is an issue that's affecting everyone. So what we do first is, in order to protect against ransomware, it's probably important to understand what ransomware is and how it works. There are a number of different infection vectors. The one that's probably most relevant or most prevalent is the use of spam email. So with spam email, an email is sent in, and an unwitting recipient clicks on a URL that might be embedded in that email. That URL takes them out to a website. Once they get to that website, they're tricked into downloading some malware, either initially a small piece of code that later downloads the right type of malware for that machine. But once the malware is installed, it goes off to do its work. And typically what it'll do is encrypt files on the machine. And depending on the type of malware, it might encrypt all your files. It might encrypt, as we've seen with GoldenEye, just automatic boot records. And once the files are encrypted, typically the ransomware and malware will communicate with the command and control center, send the key back that was used to encrypt those files, and then send you a ransom note. And the ransom typically is the demand to be paid in a virtual currency, like something like Bitcoin. And that's been the typical, I suppose, chain of events for ransomware that we've seen. The recent attacks have kind of stepped up the game a little bit. So rather than just encrypting local files, or for a machine encrypting, say, files that machine was connected to over network, like network shares, the ransomware embedded with worms has meant that now the ransomware can spread either to machines on your local network, or wherever it can connect internally, as we've seen with GoldenEye, or globally, and whenever that machine can connect externally, as we've seen with WannaCry. So that, I suppose, sets the scene, a bit about what ransomware is and what it does. We'll just ask Liz now to say, if this is what you're faced with, how do you go to set about protecting yourself from ransomware?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. This is Liz here speaking. So what I want to take you through, and I'm sure much of this you'll have heard already through whether it's various circulars, you'll have seen it on news releases, and it's basically all the steps you need to take in advance, all the steps you need to take during a potential ransomware incident and recovery from it. what we've done is we've taken a lot of the advice that's out there, plus our own experience, and put it together and brought it into a staged approach. So the approach you want to works through 5 key areas. So the first is preparation. So what you can do now to prepare for the event of actually having a ransomware issue. Then we look at patching, we look at blocking, monitoring, and responding. So what I'll do is I'll take you through each of these areas, and as I go through each of these areas, we'll link back to how Paul described the anatomy of a ransomware attack. We'll link back to that just to show how each of these areas links back to the various stages of that anatomy. I'll also bring up key areas within each of these stages that we've worked through. And then finally, all the way through, and you'll see it in the bottom right hand of the screen each time, will be a grey box which links us back, and we always come back to, well, what's the most recent issue we've had, which was WannaCry and the GoldenEye ransomware. So just to link the area that I'm talking to back to each of those, to say, well, what could we have done in this stage, you know, if it was one of those particular ransomware attacks. So the first area we're going to look at is preparation. And this is a key area because this is where the majority of companies are right now. So this is where organizations are right now, which is what can you do today. So the first one on top of the list, and it really is key because as Paul said, a lot of this ransomware is initiated by email or by spam email or even by surfing the web. So really it's security awareness training. Enough for everybody within an organization to understand their role when it comes to protecting that organization. So it's imperative to ensure that all in the organization are aware of the threat of ransomware and at a high level to understand how it can be delivered. In other words, to know that this is an email that has that they are unsure of its source or unsure of the content, not to click on it but to ask. The second area I've mentioned is network segmentation. Again, this is something that organizations can address straight away right now, which is restricting the flow of communication between zones. So you need to look at your organization and zone it. Put your critical assets into a particular zone, put your file shares into particular zones, and only allow access as required into those areas. So by restricting and by putting in place network segmentation, we can prevent what happened, to a degree, what happened, as Paul described, for WannaCry and also for GoldenEye, which is the spread of ransomware across the network. Thirdly then is access control. Again, this is least privileged basis for access. So, you know, personnel within an organization really should only have access to what they need to have access to. So if someone within your organization is a subject of ransomware, well, if they don't have access to a file share, it's one level of protection straight away because they didn't need to have access to it, so the ransomware doesn't access it. So that's very important. And finally then, in the preparation phase, and I know this one can't be stressed enough, is regular backups. And regular backups are absolutely paramount. And it's not just regular, yes, they're regular, they're tested that they are correct, and also that they're stored offline. There's absolutely no point in having backups online on your network because then they're also at risk. So if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, as I said, in terms of the 2 most recent ransomware issues, what kind of areas have we addressed straight away when you consider preparation? We've already talked about security awareness among our users, so that straight away addresses the issue of spam email and phishing emails and unknown attachments. So it's your source, it's the initial source in terms of the anatomy of ransomware. Secondly then, as Paul spoke about, the 2 ransomware, both WannaCry and GoldenEye, both had a very unique within them which they could spread quite rapidly within the network. One of them using the SMB exploit and the other using WMIC, which is the Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line. So again, being aware that these kind of vectors can be used, we can look at preventing that. So for SMB, it was to disable SMB version 1 and 2, and for WMIC, it was to prevent that command line from being accessed. So that's the first area in terms of preparation. Second area is patching. Again, a huge amount of conversations happening all around patching since these 2 ransomware outbreaks. And it can't be stressed enough that every organization needs centralized vulnerability and patch management. So in terms of vulnerability management, you need to identify what are your vulnerable hosts. So again, within an organization, vulnerability management, you need to be able to scan your organization on a regular basis and to be able to identify, have you any known vulnerabilities? And remember, we've seen in a lot of reports that a lot of the exploits that happen are actually from known vulnerabilities, and we treat these WannaCry and GoldenEye zero-day attacks, but what they're actually exploiting are known vulnerabilities, which very well could have been patched. So if we look at even the vulnerability that was exploited for both of these ransomware issues. We can see that it was a Samba vulnerability. The patch for this was released right back on the 14th of March 2017, so it was a known vulnerability. So as I said, first is to identify vulnerable hosts, and this can be done in a number of ways, and there's many different applications and solutions out there to assist. We've listed a couple here. IBM QRadar Vulnerability Manager or Qualys are two types of scanning tools which you can use at periodic frequency across your network and do vulnerability scans. Again, doing a vulnerability scan of your entire network can bring back thousands and thousands of records which can be difficult to understand, difficult to interpret. So we would advise zoning your network into your critical zones, whether it's put your critical assets, your external firewalls, etc., into a critical zone and do those more regularly, and then prioritize your vulnerabilities and allow patching. So testing and patching then your vulnerable hosts. Again, there's solutions such as IBM BigFix, BigQuery listed there. But patching isn't as simple as taking those thousands of lists of vulnerabilities and patching against them. You need to prioritize them. And it's really important to understand the impact of a vulnerability. So a vulnerability may appear as quite critical and high level on your listing, but in actual fact you may have mitigated it elsewhere, whether on an edge firewall, IPS, IDS, but it may not be as critical. So it's really important that all the vulnerability scans that are run are actually interpreted correctly. In terms of patching then, and we've seen this with quite a number of clients we work with, is that their patching cycles are somewhat out of sync. So your patching cycle needs to be in sync with your vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management cycle. So doing a vulnerability scan, finding your vulnerabilities, prioritizing them, and having them ready to deal with and then patch needs to obviously happen cyclically and in advance of your patching cycle. So you need to align both of those. And obviously from that we have the standard patching, and again, depending on your patching cycle, that could be on a critical zone, it could be monthly, it could be every 2 weeks. On a less critical, it could be quarterly, it could be biannually. And finally then, security patching. Those of you who would work with us before will be well aware of these security advisories we send out from time to time. I know you get them from vendors as well and various other sources in terms of security patches being released at various stages, whether it's monthly, from the weekly, and then they're ad hoc releases. The next one then that I've mentioned is legacy systems, because we get this query a lot from clients, which is, well, I have a server, it's quite an old server, it's running an application, I don't want to patch it because, you know, it'll fail, it's no longer supported, but I need to keep it running. And this can be done. It's really a case of isolating that solution, protecting around the solution rather than trying to patch the actual system itself, or if it's an application, by whitelisting it during these scans. So again, the last point here is an important one. Vulnerability management and patch management, they're continuous and they must be aligned. So it's really important in terms of ensuring that your patch management has the correct effect and at the right moment in time. The next stage we're looking at then is blocking. Again, this is more of an action stage, so it's to prevent potential malware or potential ransomware from actually accessing your organization. So there's a number of areas we've listed here. The first one, and it goes back to that first step on the anatomy of ransomware, as Paul pointed out, which is that spam email or your access point. The first point then is to put in place mail gateway solutions. These are both URL for websites and also email filtering gateways. Again, we've noted a couple there, Fortinet, Fortimail being one of them. And the idea here is for spam filtering against the spam emails, as Paul has pointed out, to filter those phishing emails and take them out of the loop so they're not actually getting to the end user. So you can detect and you can filter also executable files, which is also very important because unwittingly many end users will click on executable files. Another stage to add to that is also the use of a sandbox. And a sandbox really is an area off your network where you can take what looks like a suspicious email or attachment and you can actually unwrap that or explode it within that sandbox and see really, you know, is it actually of threat. And again, if you're receiving quite a number of the same potential issues or potential threats, well, that's a good way to do it, to actually determine is it or is it not a threat to your organization. The next one then is next generation antivirus solutions. And this has really gained momentum quite a lot in the last while, and especially down to the endpoint, because previously we would have seen antivirus, we'd all have considered just as being a protection device, or protection solution, I should say, but now it also covers detect and respond as well, in that it can actually detect threats right to the endpoint, and we can also block and respond at the endpoint as well. So obviously, if you're looking at preparation in terms of your next generation antivirus solutions is to ensure that the latest signatures and indicators of compromise are in place and on those at all times. So it's almost like considering it patching your antivirus, if you want to call it that, but it's keeping your antivirus up to date. So maybe it's something that you do in line with a patching cycle, is to review your antivirus. Finally then, we have the perimeter firewalls. Obviously most of the potential threats that we see are from external rather than internal, in this particular instance for ransomware. So your perimeter firewalls play a huge part. So blocking known bad IPs is a standard procedure, and also to detect and block command and control traffic. So there are many solutions that can assist with that. Fortinet FortiGates do it, IBM XGS, for example. In terms of WannaCry and GoldenEye, again, just relating back to this, what could we have done in the blocking phase? Well, as already mentioned, the protocols SMB version 1 and version 2 were exploited to allow WannaCry to traverse across networks. So disabling that straight away is blocking that potential to traverse. Also WMIC, when it came to GoldenEye, could also block inbound TCP ports to prevent potential threats. And also then on GoldenEye, one of the things on GoldenEye, as Paul had pointed out, was that it actually encrypted the main boot record. So then it forced you to reboot your machine. And therefore, the loss was much, much greater in terms of GoldenEye than it was in WannaCry. So WannaCry, you encrypt a few files and lose it. However, with GoldenEye, it's the entire system that you actually lose. So one area to actually put in a block is to prevent your machine from actually preventing it from creating the Windows scheduler task, which forces that restart, and that would prevent the restart from actually occurring. Some additional considerations, like I've said, everything there that we've listed on the block slide really is considering external. What can we do to prevent it from external? The threats obviously always exist internally as well. And when I say internally, it's someone again unwittingly, plugging in a USB port or bringing information into the network. So again, locking down ports or DLP or USB port lockdown or disabling is also another option to keep in mind. In terms of monitoring then, so monitoring is important because monitoring is continuous and it's also real time, and it must be real time. So there's a few points that I wanted to pull out on monitoring, and it's important to note on the bottom left, when we look at the anatomy of ransomware, this affects all the stages, monitoring, because we're monitoring all the time across all potentials, whether it's the spam email at the outside, so we're monitoring there for potentially phishing emails, all the way through to the spread internally. So for monitoring, the first area I've listed is a holistic security operations, and we can't stress this enough. You really need a security operations center or an equivalent of. Many organizations are looking at outsourcing this, many have it in-house. Obviously, it's driven quite heavily by resources, that is skilled and qualified personnel, processes, such as that we're talking about right now in terms of ransomware, having defined processes and having people who can step through those processes. And finally then technology, and I've mentioned some pieces of technology as we've made our way through the slides. So it's a huge investment, so really it's a consideration as to whether to go outsource and how. In terms of next generation antivirus solutions, again, I mention it here again because it also has a monitoring element in terms of detect, and that's the next generation element, being able to do detect and respond, and some examples there around Carbon Black and McAfee. The next piece of technology is SIEM, Security Information and Event Management. This is continuous monitoring of your estate, and it's for security threats. And it's really, really important. In terms of your SIEM, which you can log to that, generally we'll always advise to log key elements. In other words, what we've mentioned already, the things we want to protect: external firewalls, IPS, IDS, domain controller servers, because it tells you what people are doing, what they're accessing, AV servers, antivirus servers, critical servers, particularly database servers or anywhere that critical information is stored, or repositories. So that's all really important, and it gives us, if you do have an incident, it gives a storyline that we can follow in the background, or you can follow in the background using SIEM as to what actually happened. And also can give us key indicators if we do see flows or traffic that's happening that might give an indication that potentially, for instance, you already have malware or within the network, and it's actually conversing externally out to a command and control server. All of these solutions are great, however, keeping them updated and keeping current is really, really important. And that's where our threat intelligence feed comes in, because we have continuous feeds that you can then bring into your organization that give you updates on new vulnerabilities and new threats constantly. And this is continuous. It's daily, nightly, all the time, 24/7. The key ones we've mentioned here, IBM X-Force and Fortinet FortiGuard, give you that constant feed in terms of new vulnerabilities. So when we look at what we would have considered 0-day, even though realistically the vulnerabilities were always there, but the attack itself was 0-day for WannaCry and for GoldenEye, within an hour or two of those being released straight away, you would get feeds on the threat intelligence side and updates on SIEM preventative measures from those vendors to try and protect environments. The last area then is in terms of response. Unfortunately, and this is one of Paul's lines, but I'm going to steal it, bad things happen to good people. So all the preparation, all of the patching, blocking, monitoring, etc., you can still, however, unfortunately, and we've seen it, people are still susceptible and can get hit with ransomware or other malware attacks. So to that end, you need to be able to respond. So incident management is absolutely crucial. And what do I mean by incident management? It's having the ability to be able to do essentially the following steps. And these really follow the NIST steps in terms of managing an incident. So being able to identify and classify the incident straight away. And sometimes that can be the hardest part, to actually know that you have an incident. And unfortunately, the highest percentage of incidents, the client or the organization is notified, unfortunately, externally by someone else who tells them, look, we can see you have an incident. That maybe they've sent out a mail from themselves, or that a user then can see that they're locked out of their systems in terms of ransomware. So that incident classification and incident identification is really important. In terms of this ransomware, containment is critical, because as we've said, it actually traverses across networks. So immediately you need to isolate the system that has been affected. Notification then to all users, and that's internally, and then externally is required out to partners and other organizations. Eradication then and recovery. Recovery obviously can only be assisted by having backups and very recent backups available to you to bring back onto your solution. And finally then, lessons learned in future work, because this is important. Because once you go through, unfortunately, an incident like this, the most important thing is to understand where your weak point was. Was it an end user who opened an email? Was it the fact that your network wasn't segmented? Was it the fact that you weren't patched? So really it's important to identify where the weak point was. And throughout any incident, and as I'm sure everyone who's on the call will know, through any an incident, whether it's ransomware or whether it's a simple ICT type incident, communications is critical. And that's communications down to the end user, up to the C-level, and then out to any end clients that you may have or partners. So if we look at WannaCry and GoldenEye in terms of incident management, if you had an incident management or response procedure in place, how would it have helped? Well, straight away you would have been able to confirm that you had an incident, isolated because you know, okay, this is ransomware, and you have a procedure in place for isolation, communication awareness, and obviously most critical, restore, backup, and recover. So that brings us to the end of the respond phase. And I just have one slide here, which really is a slide to bring together all of those areas. So it's firstly to show that at the center you have whether it's your security team, whether it's the security operations center, and there's various processes you have to follow. We've stepped through just the high level points on each of these in terms of prepare, patch, monitor, block, and respond. And that's one process that the likes of the SOC would have in place. But in terms of being able to prepare for that, there's key elements required. Obviously, the DNA or the knowledge behind that, and processes and procedures set in place and very stringently set in place, and also the technology to order to facilitate you to do each of these steps. But most crucially, we found you also need the people, and there's a number of different people you need for this. It's your end users to have that security awareness, but it's also your staff who are trained to understand what ransomware is, how to deal with it, and to have the security training to be able to remediate and recover. And this is a very short webinar, so I apologize. I know I'm going very quick, but to summarize and to bring you to the 8 top points that really we see as key in terms of the ransomware attacks that we've seen and potentially any that will come out, because I really do believe it's a repeat every time of the same critical areas, which are firstly, ensure you have security awareness training in place and that it's actually functioning and people are aware of their role within it. Perform, test and secure backups on a regular basis. Cannot stress enough, backups must be performed, must be held offline and separate to your network. Implement mail gateway solutions with filtering. Again, most of these are initiated through email. Implement centralized vulnerability and patch management solutions. So for this, as I said, it's important to ensure that your vulnerability and your patch management are aligned, so that you're doing vulnerability assessments followed by patch management, so you're getting the maximum benefit out of both. Implement next generation antivirus solutions, and as we've said, those have progressed a lot now from just the days of protect to also detect and respond. Configure perimeter security devices, and again, we've talked about next generation firewalls, IPS, IDS, etc. Internally segment your networks. This one has become really, really prevalent with the fact that ransomware now has a new focus, which is traversing internally within the networks. And finally then, to implement a holistic and centralized security operations and management approach, whether this is through a security operations center outsourced or through your own internal in-house security operations. But it's vital that everyone knows their role within that. So following on from this, what we want to do is just step you through. We have as Rebecca mentioned, we have an assessment which each of you will be able to take after this, which will give you a really good indication of where you lie in terms of your security stature or areas you need to cover. So I'm going to bring that up on the screen and I'll let Paul just talk through it.
Yeah, so we have put together a small little assessment questionnaire that if you fill in, send an email address, we'll send you on some of the results. The link is there, it'll be sent out to you, but once you click through it, just that basically asks you a set of kind of yes/no questions. There's a data protection piece at the front. Once you're happy with that, just scroll down. So the questions around user awareness and training. Do you deliver training? Do you test it? And then do you go and do something like social engineering testing to see how susceptible your users are to threats such as phishing? Then I have some questions around backups. So do you complete backups? If you do, have you checked the integrity of the backup and the restoration process? And lastly, a question on, as Liz mentioned during the webinar, have you got those backups, stored offline in security? Questions around endpoint. So typically questions around things like, have you got patch management in place? If you do, how often do you patch? Is it within a week? Also, one thing that we see an awful lot of people don't do is patch those third-party applications as well as OS. So if you do that, next on the endpoint will be antivirus, anti-malware. Again, is it in place? Is it up to date? And then lastly is maybe around vulnerability assessment. So do you use something like IBM or Qualys to do some internal vulnerability assessments, so running scans internally to see where you are vulnerable with your hosts and systems, either from an OS perspective or an application perspective. In terms of content protection, have you got email filtering in place? Do you have spam filtering to help protect your end users? And then you have web and URL filtering. So for that end user that does happen to click on that malicious link that tries to download some malware, have your web filtering to protect you from that. Next generation firewalls are key and critical to have as part of your perimeter. Things like standalone network IPSs, the ability to virtually patch those systems. And what we mean by that is if you identify, say, a vulnerability using a vulnerability assessment or patch management solution that you need to patch 500 servers, and this is critical, but you can't patch them all straight away, can you use your IPS to deploy something like a virtual patch so that at the network level you are virtually patching those systems while you go on and deploy your patching. And then the more mature organizations will have things like sandboxes in place to help, scan all mail and web traffic, see what malicious content may be there, what content might be embedded or executables embedded, explode them and see what their behavior is like. Separately, internal networks, this is something we've always had in the checklist. It's become more prominent now, I suppose, with the likes of the WannaCry GoldenEye attacks, where malware has been embedded with worms to help it spread through the network. And then finally, some questions around incident management. So you have an incident management process in place to help you against your malware and ransomware attacks. And then you have integrated approaches. So having these point solutions is fine, and most organizations, in fact, the recent, I think, an IBM study said that most organizations have about 85 or plus security tools. So you have something in place to help you give you an integrated approach, such as SIEM, endpoint, content management. And then finally, what about endpoint detection and response? So one thing that we do see is if you do have a malware outbreak and you manage to, block your network and block traffic, next, where else is it? Where else could it be on your network? So we've seen a lot of interest recently in what some people call next generation endpoint tools, or I suppose Gardner calls it endpoint detection and response. And these really are tools which will help you do a couple of things. First, they'll help you analyze what happened. So if there was a malware outbreak and you've got access to the endpoint detection and response to that machine, it'll show you the user went to this URL, they downloaded this piece of code, or perhaps it executed this piece of PowerShell, which then executes a piece of code. And here we can see what that bit of code is. And then you can go and use that tool to go and search, where is this piece of malware elsewhere on my network, or where have I seen other machines that have exhibited this behavior, whether it's been to try and go to that URL, or maybe to try and connect to that command control site, but it has an encrypted machine because it hasn't done so. So if you go through that and just drop your email address, what we'll do is we analyze those results and just give you a quick kind of summary of a position, your stance on malware, ransomware in your network.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I just see one question that has come in there about how logically to separate internal networks. So separating your network internally, so you can use internal segmentation firewalls. So obviously it won't be as large as your external perimeter firewalls, but you can use those to separate internally. And then you put access control lists either on switches or routers as well, which will block traffic such as SN and MB between zones, which you mentioned earlier. That's two ways of logically separating your internal network.
Okay, so that's our 30 minutes pretty much used up today, and we'd like to thank everyone for your time and some of the questions that have come in. The link to the questionnaire we'll send out to you in due course, and if you have any other questions, send them in and we'll try and answer them. Once again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.